Hello and good evening all. This week we're continuing with our 5 Cars That series with what I think is the logical successor to last time's 5 race cars that never got off the ground, which is 5 race cars that barely got off the ground. This in lieu of the arguably contrapositive 5 race cars that really got off the ground, which, depending on whether one wanted to do that literally or figuratively, could get, quite entertaining, but we've heard of all the cars that figuratively really got off the ground already. Or at least most of them. Anyway, the idea for this one is cars that did actually get to the racetrack and usually saw the green flag, perhaps even a few times, but fell far short of their potential. As with last week's video, the individual segments will be posted ex post facto for research purposes, but these cars are presented in an intentional order, starting with 2 cars that only raced a single or a partial season, and closing with a couple of cars that never even managed to finish a single race, along with an honorable mention to close. Let's get started with the Porsche 961. This is admittedly a bit of a weak entry to start off with, as the 961 did actually win a race that it contested, which is more than can be said for any of the other cars that we'll be covering. Nevertheless, the program's ambitions relative to what actually came about is sufficient, in my mind, to qualify it for this video. Coming into the mid-1980s, Porsche had just racked up a series of World Sports Car Championship and Le Mans victories in prototype racing with the 956 and 962 Group C cars. The GT category, intended to stand companion to Group C, was the imaginatively named Group B, a rule set that is these days better known for its contributions to the golden age of rallying, but in reality it was intended for use in sports car racing as well. The motivations for designing a new car to these rules came about from several convergent channels in the early 1980s. Chief among them was the knowledge that the 911, the company's, economic everything, pretty much, was approaching its maximum potential as an automobile that was still fundamentally based on the original Beetle. In 1981, when design work on the new car, at the time just called the Gruppe B, commenced, the original replacement for the 911, the excellent and radically different 928, had been on the market for 3 years, and despite being the first and to date only sports car to win European Car of the Year, and having seen moderate sales success, it was appealing to a fundamentally different consumer demographic than the 911. Meanwhile, the drop-off in 911 sales that had occurred in the 1970s and spooked Porsche's management into the 928 program had more or less stabilized, presumably because...
what with all these gas crises and Watergates, I needed a good laugh.
Or something, I'm reaching a bit with that reference. Be that as it may, the remit for 1981, coming from newly appointed Managing Director Peter Schutz's office, was to build the ultimate 911 to see what the platform was fundamentally capable of, with approval given for a motorsports program in Group B to speed up development. Early on the build punch list was the design and integration of an all-wheel drive system to take advantage of that opening in the rulebook, with much of the other mechanical componentry lifted from the contemporaneous Porsche Group C parts bin, initially, of course, sharing its bits with the 956, which later became the 962, but from an engine and drivetrain perspective didn't change all that much from one to the other. Initial development progressed not exactly at a snail's pace, but in contrast to some of the cars we'll be looking at later in the video, it wouldn't really be considered a crash program either, and the initial Gruppe B prototype was ready in 1983. But of course, Group B was a homologation class, and so production plans were put in motion to turn the car into a production road and race car for sale to the public and to customer racing squads, as, of course, Porsche had been having success with both of those sales paths with their other road cars and with their past and present racing cars for some time. The road-going version of the 961 was, as we all know, the 959, which is arguably much better remembered, and mostly remembered as Porsche's first attempt at a supercar. That being said, they were both mechanically equipped thus. A, surprise of surprises, horizontally opposed 6-cylinder engine, displacing 2.8 liters and equipped with sequential twin turbochargers, all carried over from the 935 and essentially the same engine as had already been implemented in the 956 and 62. In the 959, it produced 444 horsepower and 369 pound-feet of torque, while the 961 ran substantially higher boost pressures and made 680 horsepower as a result. This sent power to all four wheels, which actually is a bit of a combo breaker for this channel, through a 6-speed manual gearbox, with the 959 sold with driver-adjustable power bias between front and rear wheels, while the 961 was set up to be rear-wheel drive biased. Likewise, the 959 was fitted with adjustable damper and suspension systems to improve stability and road holding, while the 961 had more racing-focused componentry that could only be adjusted by qualified pit crew. Nevertheless, it was still double wishbone suspension on all four wheels, and Dunlop developed the tires for the car, as they were already working with Porsche on the Group C cars, and, well, why ruin a good thing when you've got one going? The 959 and 961 were built around a lightweight exotic material chassis and draped in equally exotic bodywork constructed from aluminum and Kevlar with a floor built from Nomex, which, yes, that's the fire-resistant material more commonly found in racing suits than racing cars. In the 961, the bodywork panels were even further reduced to save as much weight as possible, reduced in thickness that is, and thus the 961 weighed in at 1,150 kilos or 2,540 pounds, while the 959, with its radio and comfortable seats and other such effrippant effronteries, kept the needle going another 300 kilograms higher to land at 3,197 pounds, which it sounds like a lot, but you have to bear in mind that we're talking about a car that, when it went on sale, was the fastest road car in the world at a top speed of 198 miles an hour and was capable of 0 to 100 kph, or 62 miles an hour, in 3.7 seconds, which was effectively unheard of at the time. An additional 235 or so horsepower and the loss of 660 pounds should have made a compelling difference. And top speed for the 961 was reported at 211 miles an hour, or 340 kph, although an acceleration time of 0 to 100 was not readily available. The 959 was set for production in mid-late 1985 and was intended to compete in the 1986 World Sports Car Championship season, but two issues had arisen. One, homologation quantities still had to be met, and not only was Porsche subcontracting out the building of the 959 to Carrosserie Bauer, but they were losing the better part of $250,000 US in 1985's money to build each one. Then there were various difficulties in the production itself, and this meant that deliveries wouldn't actually begin until 1987. And issue 4 out of our 2 issues, but perhaps a less critical one, nobody was really participating in Group B in the World Sports Car Championship anyway. So, not great. Porsche then started to pivot the plans for the car to rallying, and after a few test cars with naturally aspirated engines entered, but failed to finish the 1985 Paris-Dakar, as the Paris-Dakar had no homologation requirements, and thus they could be throwing whatever experimental cars they wanted at the problem, 1986 was the year for the true car to assume its competition mantle, despite production not yet really having started, and it started off its competition career with a bang, running 1-2 in class at the Paris-Dakar, won by René Metge and followed by the great Jackie Ickx. At the Le Mans test that year, it was Metge again who put in the fastest time, well ahead of the, I wrote denuded Group B field. It was a sample size of 1, and indeed the car was faster than a fair few of the Group C vehicles as well, which boded well for the car's prospective performance at Les Arts that June. However, since the production quantities to achieve homologation as a Group B car, which is 200 units, was still hugely distant, the 961 was instead entered as an IMSA GTX vehicle, which had no such restrictions, but was also the sole entrant in category. So you had effectively 2 GT cars and the rest were all Group C1s or C2s. Nevertheless, the 961 started mid-pack at Le Mans, while the BMW M1 that made up the entirety of the Group B field was last on the grid, its final Le Mans appearance, but the 961's combination of road car-derived robustness and competition-proven mechanicals carried over from the Group C cars proved a compelling mix, with the car working its way up to the top 10 by morning and finally finishing 7th overall, behind 5 proper Group C Porsches and a 936 that was dressed up as a heavily modified Group 6 car, but technically now was grandfathered as a Group C. It was a weird time. Nevertheless, the car was ahead of every Group C2 car and a number of the other C1 cars, including a fair few privateer 956s and 962s. It did, of course, best the M1 by a wide margin, although the M1 did finish Le Mans, and Porsche shipped the car over to the US to run an IMSA event to try out those waters for next year. In IMSA competition, it was reclassified to compete directly with the prototype GTPs, which were, effectively Group C cars, but with slightly different rules and no fuel consumption requirements, and was thus decidedly not optimized for the venue of its first race outing stateside, Daytona, and its tires proved its proverbial weakest link given the track's high speed and the loading caused by the bank turns. So they gave that up as a bad job and shipped it home. They did enter Le Mans again in '87, but the car crashed out, having run just outside the top 10, and with nobody else participating in Group B in sports car racing anymore, Porsche canned the project completely, as its potential as a rally car had been similarly undercut after the FIA killed the class on safety grounds for any non-track applications. The car was repaired after its crash, and now lives nice and snug on display in the Porsche Museum in Stuttgart. Okay, let's step towards the slightly more unsuccessful end of the racing world, starting with a car that, while seeing more entries than the 961, hardly managed to finish at all. The Ford P68 or F3L or 3-liter GT, whatever you want to call it. Following Ford's blowout victories in 1966 and 67 at Le Mans and elsewhere in the World Sports Car Championship, with increasingly mature iterations of the GT40, the FIA pulled one of their all-too-common tricks out of the bag and rewrote the rules in pursuit of safety, because of the high speeds that the Fords and Ferrari P cars were reaching. Group 6 cars, the rule set to which the GT40 and its subsequent iterations had originally been constructed, now had a displacement limit of 3 liters, and a new iteration of the Group 4 class for production-adjacent cars was capped at 5 liters, sending both the 66 and 67 winning iterations of the car into obsolescence with their
7-liter V8 motor.
Ford and Ferrari both withdrew from their factory efforts as a result. Thus, 2 development paths remained open to Ford through privateer teams. One could rehash earlier, unsuccessful iterations of the GT40's powerplant and design to compete in Group 4, as production quantities were getting to where they needed to be, which is 50 cars, or source a new powerplant and design a new chassis for the Group 6 rules. While, actually, as an aside, my reading of the rules is that it would have been feasible to use the old GT40 chassis with a new, smaller engine to run in Group 6, it would not have been the most efficient use of space because, obviously, it was designed to fit big, rumbly V8s, and a 3-liter V8 versus a 7-liter V8 kind of, have slightly different footprints when it comes to how much space they take up in a chassis. Thus, perhaps unsurprisingly, 2 different teams took up each mantle in hopes of continuing the Blue Oval's success. John Wyer, of course, late of the Aston Martin factory team, continued along with the GT40 in Group 4, and we all know how that went, but Alan Mann Racing, whose association with Ford came about through a more diverse background that included campaigning everything from Cortinas and Escorts on up, decided to use a version of the Cosworth DFV powerplant with which they were already familiar to power their new design. Another quick sidebar that I always feel compelled to mention when we talk about the Alan Mann Racing team, they also built the original Chitty Chitty Bang Bang cars for the delightful 1968 children's musical film of the same name, based on the novel by Ian Fleming. And in keeping with the theme, I think we can consider that to be a car that definitely did get off the ground, albeit to fly to Ersatz, Bavaria to rescue children from Baron von Bombburst. But back in the real world, the Alan Mann Racing Squad, with the promise of Ford UK's support, leveraged the Formula One-derived 3-liter DFV powerplant that the division had already developed to deploy as the beating heart of their new Group 6 car. Leveraging the design talents of Mr. Len Bailey, who had previously worked on Ford concepts back to the turbine cars, with Eric Broadley on the original GT40, and on a Can-Am design called the Honker, to which the new design did bear more than a passing resemblance, the team took advantage of a loophole in the rules that allowed for open-topped cars to be much lower than closed cockpit ones, and essentially built a target-top car without the actual top, creating an extremely low, efficient, and streamlined body that had a drag coefficient of only 0.27. For reference, the GT40s were around 0.35, and the Lola T70 Mark III Coupe was almost 0.5. And thus the P68 was theoretically capable of 217 miles an hour, or 350 kph, down the Mulsanne Straight. Bodywork was ultra-thin and thus ultra-light alloy panels draped over a primarily aluminum monocoque, though the bulkheads were reportedly still steel, and reports differ on whether or not the engine served as a fully stressed member of the chassis. We're going to go with Silodrome's cited assertion that it indeed was not, based on the recommendations of the Cosworth engineers who helped with the integration of the DFV power plant, but no doubt somebody's going to show up in the comments to fact-check or make snide comments one way or the other. Y'all are so nice on the internet, you know that? Anyway, the suspension was up to the minute, double wishbones and coil springs in the front, while the rear sported reversed lower wishbones with top links and springs, while brakes were mounted inboard of the suspension uprights for better cooling. The DFV was in a fairly high state of tune, putting out 420 horsepower and 366 pound-feet of torque through another iteration of the equally ubiquitous Hewland 5-speed manual gearbox, naturally going to the rear wheels, while total car weight was only 670 kilos or 1,477 pounds, which I think we can all agree is more appropriate for a featherweight prototype than some of the early Bruiser GT40s. Work on the J-car notwithstanding. The initial bodywork used an uninterrupted, sloping longtail with a few innovations intended to create downforce without adding drag, which is, as we all know, something of a holy grail as far as aerodynamicists are concerned, but as Porsche would soon be learning with the 910s and 917s, the race gods do not cede their aerodynamic secrets lightly, and the P68 was quite the Larry beast to drive early on, experiencing the same sorts of high-speed lightness as the Stuttgarters would soon be experiencing, and causing John Surtees to refuse to drive the car outright, despite his being brought in as a test driver after his success with developing the Lola T70s. Ironically, the P68 could possibly have saved Jim Clark's life, despite its Larryness. Alan Mann reportedly tried to convince Lotus to lend him, Mr. Clark, and Graham Hill for the car's debut at Brands Hatch. Lotus refused, sending the duo to a previously committed date at a Formula 2 race at Hockenheim, and unfortunately we all know what happened there. The car struggled with overheating and poor preparation, with the Bruce McLaren Denny... Hulme? We're trying a new pronunciation. Hulme? Anybody that can't hear pronouncing the L this time is just going to get an immediate ban from further commenting, or I'm just going to start saying it Hulme to piss everybody off. Anyway, the car still managed to qualify second, while the other car, there were 2 entries, qualified fifth, but they basically melted the engine in the process. In race, the car was again incredibly quick, but it was also very difficult to work on in the pits, and when a drive shaft failed in the second hour, it was day done for the Alan Mann racing team. At the Nürburgring 1,000 kilometers, the car's next entry, one of the P68s actually did get airborne going over Flugplatz, which ended the career, but fortunately not the life, of driver Chris Irwin. Mann actually ordered the chassis scrapped, as it had also quite tangentially figured into the deaths of Jim Clark and Mike Spence, who had passed while testing for Lotus at the Indy 500, and he considered the chassis to be, at this point, slightly cursed. Plans were in place to build a replacement chassis to have 2 ready for 1969, while the rest of the 1968 season saw the team go from failure to failure, although a small rear lip was added to attempt to correct the car's Larryness. There is obviously an emphasis on attempt. 1969 saw an updated car built as an open-topped Spider, the P69, as well as plans for 2 more P68s that now sported subtle rear wings to more fully counteract the light rear. But in the overwinter period, the FIA changed the rules for Group 4 to drop required production quantities, and Porsche developed the 917, which would have put the nail in the coffin for the car the subsequent year anyway, but Ford/Alan Mann didn't even get that far. Only one additional P68 was built instead of the two planned, and it was entered with the P69 at Brands Hatch that year. The P69 failed in practice, and the 68 lasted less than half an hour in race, both with failed engines. The next round at Silverstone was, if possible, even worse. Only one P68 was in attendance, and that car retired in rainy conditions before the green flag ever flew, with the electrics saturated. Ford's patience, meanwhile, had dried up, and the project was cancelled, with the two remaining cars kept by Ford as display models until the 1970s. In 2006, Chassis 02 was restored by Mr. Len Bailey himself and sold at Bonhams in 2018 for what I consider to be a stupidly low price of 511,000 British pounds, which I think at the time was about 700,000 US dollars. Some say that Chassis 01 was never destroyed, but that is, of course, hearsay. Okay, let's fast forward to modernity and our last car with, well, a glimmer of hope in its development history, which is the technically Not-Acura Honda Performance Development, or HPD ARX-04b. Honda's Performance Development Division had been making a pretty big splash in sports car racing in the late 2000s and early 2010s, taking the LMP2 fight to the likes of Courage, later Orica, Dallara, Lola, Pescarolo, and Zytek, admittedly with the use of Courage-based chassis for many of their early efforts. Using pretty much the same Courage-derived tub geometry in LMP1 and LMP2, HPD cars had won more than 70 class victories in the ALMS and the first World Endurance Championship LMP2 Championship with the ARX-01 and 03. The only blip on that particular radar was the ARX-02, not because it was unsuccessful, but because it was designed as a new Le Mans prototype for Honda and Acura directly by Würth Research as an LMP1. It went on to dominate the 2009 American Le Mans Series, at least when there wasn't a diesel spaceship squad around to spend more on catering than most of the teams were spending on the entire race weekend, but it lasted only a single season and was retired when the ARX-03 came out. 2014 brought a change in the LMP2 rules, and with it, a new car to replace the soon-to-be superannuated ARX-03. Following a naming convention staggering in its creativity, the replacement for it was the, wait for it, ARX-04. Such creativity, much wow. The new regulations, as we've discussed in a few other videos, pretty much required everyone to be either running closed cockpits immediately or in the imminent future, and so HPD took the opportunity to more radically design a new car for this closed cockpit LMP2 and LMP1 future, pursuing a closer relationship with Würth, who, apart from the 02, had primarily served as a chassis constructor for in-house derivatives of the Courage design. It was the first closed cockpit design for the Mark, and, like its preceding cars, was originally intended to be offered as both an LMP1 and LMP2, with the P1s having an A suffix, ARX-04A, and P2s having a B. Nevertheless, they would share a common monocoque, instead differentiated by powerplant and aero packages, with both monocoque and bodywork constructed from carbon fiber composites. The LMP1 would likely have been offered with an updated version of the 3.4-liter V8 featured in the ARX-03A and C, while the 04B did indeed carry over the 03B's HR28TT 2.8-liter twin-turbo V6 derived from the contemporaneous Acura and Honda road car lineup. In competition spec, this powerplant produced 450 horsepower and 406 pound-feet of torque, sending power to the rear wheels through a 6-speed, paddle-operated sequential manual co-developed by HPD and Hewland, or at least modified by HPD from a Hewland original. In more continuations of the same, we had the suspension and stopping choices of the modern era, with double wishbones and pushrods keeping the wheels on the ground, and ventilated carbon disc brakes with 6-pot calipers keeping the wheels from hitting the tire barriers. Weight was the class-mandated 900 kilo minimum, and other parts were integrated to bring the new car in compliance with both the United Sports Car Championship and World Endurance Championship regulations, including a drive-by-wire throttle, while as much as could be carried over from the 03B was done so for the sakes of familiarity, reliability, and economics. In this venture, HPD had a partner committed to campaigning the LMP2 version in both championships, Extreme Speed Motorsports, and 2 cars had been delivered well in time for the season opener at Daytona. Thus, everything should have been fine and dandy. The 03B and its mechanicals were still fairly competitive, so with proven mechanicals, shiny new bodywork, a committed partner, experienced, what could possibly go wrong? As usual, when someone asks that question, just about everything. Ready for a big debut at Daytona, the number 1 car never made it out to set a qualifying lap, and almost worse, the number 2 car, driven by Johannes van Overbeek, was slower than the fastest prototype challenge qualifier, and almost last amongst all of the prototype class cars. In the race, the fortunes were reversed. The number 2 car, which had been inexplicably gridded in 12th position, was out after only 50 completed laps, shortly after the poor old Delta Wing, and the number 1 soldiered on to make it just over halfway in terms of total laps completed, but between their slow pace, poor aerodynamics, and other more typical new car teething issues, they would have required an absolute miracle of unspeakable proportions to really do well against the rest of the field that day. The leader of HPD at the time was quoted as saying, "We didn't show well at Daytona." Yeah, that's putting it mildly. Extreme Speed were so disappointed that they dusted off their 03Bs as a stopgap and worked on developing the car, but they gave that up as a bad job pretty quickly as well, opting instead to order Ligier LMP2s for the World Endurance Championship campaign, and only contesting the Sebring round of the United Sports Car Championship with the older car. They returned the subsequent year with their Ligiers for the endurance rounds of the inaugural IMSA season, and won in class at Daytona and Sebring. So clearly it wasn't really that big of an issue on the team's side of things. Some bright spark within the HPD organization decided that, rather than endurance racing, perhaps the car would be suitable for hill climbing, and an entry at Pikes Peak was prepared, but it failed to compete because of a busted turbocharger. Then, in 2016, Michael Shank Racing somehow got their hands on an updated version of the car and started testing it with a potential eye towards reviving the car for competition, but the improvements, while praised, were apparently insufficient, and it was merely relegated to tire testing for the subsequent season. 2 historic events have since seen an ARX-04b entered. No ARX-04a was ever completed, once in 2023 at Silverstone and once in 2024 at Donington Park, the latter where it broke the LMP2 lap record, but as far as true competition history is concerned, it remains the first of our seriously unsuccessful vehicles despite its lovely paint job. Now I want a margarita. This thing was a damn mess. That's about all I have to say about that. But seriously, after the relative success that Aston had had with Lola chassised cars in the B08 and 09/60, the latter which was more commonly called the DBR1-2, and with rule changes approaching that would require significant changes to both the car's rear aero and its power plant, the team decided to get cozier with their good friends over at ProDrive and build a new racing car from the ground up. With a target readiness date of February 2011 to be eligible for the International Le Mans Cup, design work started almost immediately after final project authorization. In autumn 2010. 6 months, chaps. Good luck. Enjoy the holidays. Fortunately, Aston had some technology on their side that meant this insanely compressed time schedule might just be feasible. Just. Almost the entire car was designed on the latest computer programs. In Aston's case, a suite of software from PTC that was capable of designing, drafting, and simulating tests of the car's aero and mechanicals. They also had access to ProDrive's enormous 3D printer, which they leveraged to rapidly prototype new components for the car. ProDrive was responsible for the chassis build this time, instead of Lola, in addition to their regular relationship with Aston for building the rest of the car after the mechanical components and chassis had arrived. And they went against the general trend, designing and constructing an open-topped car with a carbon fiber chassis noted for a relatively high belt and fairly monolithic carbon fiber bodywork that was informed by CFD work that they had done in the design stage. Airflow was prioritized to minimize front downforce, and thus a bevy of ducts directed air into the body rather than over it, emphasizing cooling across the likely speed regimen. Zoomability came not from a production-derived, naturally aspirated V12, sadly, but from a substantially smaller 2-liter turbocharged straight-six unit that Aston developed to keep in the spirit of the efficiency focus the ACO was pursuing at the time. This powerplant's 540 horsepower went to the rear wheels through an X-Track-sourced 6-speed sequential manual in a custom housing. The suspension was at least slightly interesting, as they featured a third symmetrical damper for better road holding. Off the cuff, if memory serves, Peugeot tried this with the 960 or the 9X8 as well, but I could be wrong. And as usual, everything weighed in at the class-mandated 900 kilogram weight limit. With 2 chassis constructed and 4 more planned, Aston spoke highly of their hopes for the car in the lead-up to the 2011 season, with the AMR chairman quoted that it was elegantly engineered, and that he expected it to be a competitive and reliable endurance racer. But then they missed Sebring as they were still testing, and barely had one car ready for Le Castellet, where it made its race debut, qualifying last in LMP1 and nearly 6 seconds behind the fastest qualifier, Giuliani's Rebellion, that was actually in essence an updated version of the chassis that Aston had been running previously in their closed cockpit days. And Le Castellet is not a very long track. The car was also the first retirement in race from the LMP1 class, but it did manage to complete more than half of the race distance, albeit not very quickly. The team then skipped Spa to focus on private testing after a dismal showing at the Le Mans test day, and at this point I can't well say that hopes were high for a successful run at Le Mans, particularly when faced with the prospect of a resurgent Audi with their resplendent new R18, Peugeot's redeveloped 908, and their more likely rivals in older Lola and Pescarolo machinery. In spite of these relatively low expectations, qualifying at Le Mans was even worse. The 2 cars were ready for qualifying, but the faster of the 2 was mid-pack with the LMP2s, and the slower was even further back. The only other LMP1 that was as far down the order split the 2 Astons, but it was an experimental Oreca hybrid that was coming in a year earlier than the hybrids from Audi and Toyota, and the aborted Peugeot we talked about last time, and so, it's kind of fair that it would be struggling a little bit on pace. Aston has no such excuses as far as I'm concerned. But even the forlorn hope of a miracle was hardly a hope at all, and both cars were retired within the first hour, both seeing engine issues that was traced to the plasma vapor disposition coating on the cylinder liners, which certainly sounds, Star Trek-y and impressive, but still, 2 cars out within the first hour of Le Mans is embarrassing. They withdrew from the next round at Imola, intent on further testing, and then went quiet until Silverstone, when they showed up with their older Lola coupes. And the new year brought the perhaps unsurprising announcement that they would not be continuing a prototype development program, instead pivoting to focus on their much more successful GT cars. With several chassis that had been constructed just as tubs left over, one went on to serve as the basis for the slightly longer-lived, but arguably as unsuccessful Delta Wing, and 2 more went to Pescarolo for their final LMP1 design, which was equally as unsuccessful and had only marginally better results in its 2 races, benefiting at least from a more developed and thus more reliable Judd powerplant. Driver Darren Turner attributed the car's poor results to the rushed nature of the program, which makes sense, but at the same time, the Pescarolo's similar failure the following year may also belie inherent flaws in the design itself. LMP1 was really hard in those days. And speaking tangentially of LMP1 being hard, of Nissan with the Delta Wing, and the theme of underdevelopment, let's continue in the WEC and LMP1 and talk about a car that I had immensely high hopes for, the Nissan GT-R LM Nismo. Coming into the mid-2010s, there seemed to be chinks in the Audi Mantian armor of Diesel's power at Le Mans. Despite victories in the first two races of the 2015 season for their new version of the R18, Toyota and Porsche were both getting faster year over year, and the FIA's ever-changing regulations were diminishing the efficiency benefits of the fuel over petrol engines. As a result, other manufacturers were eyeing the WEC with more interest than they had for some years, because where two might succeed, so too might others. And Nissan decided to toss their hat into the very expensive end of what had become a really expensive pool no matter how you slice it, with their first serious prototype since the R390 in 1997. Discussion of the R391 as another what might have been is a subject for a different time, the Delta Wing, of course, already having been covered, and representing a whole other, arguably even weirder sidebar. Nevertheless, Nissan called in Ben Bowlby, apparently having enjoyed his previous radical design work on what became the Delta Wing and the Ziad RC, not that they were related or similar, gave him a remit to go arguably even crazier and design a full-fat hybrid LMP1 that could compete with the other major manufacturers, but unlike them, and I quote, wasn't an Audi copy. Given that effectively every LMP1 since the start of the class had, in most ways, shapes, and forms, shared essentially all of their fundamental design features, apart from the early period where single or double roll hoops were still a matter of debate, and then the interstitial years while everyone migrated to closed cockpits, to so actively say, go do something even crazier than the Delta Wing, here's a bunch of money, was again pushing Bowlby to fly in the face of convention in new and exciting ways. And fly he did, pun partially intended. Pretty much every car discussed on this channel has been either front or mid-engined and rear or all-wheel drive, because essentially that's how you design cars that handle well. What Bowlby did, on the other hand, was build only the second front-engined LMP1, following the Panoz LMP1, but that was a rehash of the old GT1, and then he went even crazier and made the front-engined car front-wheel drive. So basically it was a giant Golf GTI, except not in any way whatsoever. Anyway, this seeming nonsense was prompted by an idea that, as everyone else had been building mid-engined cars for the better part of a decade and a half, the regulations for front aero would be comparatively relaxed relative to the strict regulations on rear aero and downforce, consequently facilitating greater downforce generation without as much drag, which does make a certain amount of sense. However, what Bowlby actually did was basically design a conventional prototype with its bodywork on backwards. If you take all the carbon fiber bodywork off, you reveal the expected carbon monocoque, but the front tires are wider than the rears, with the rears measuring 9 inches versus the front's 14s. The engine is mid-front mounted to the front of the footbox, and the gearbox is mounted right in the nose, which is essentially the same format as if you'd had a defrocked standard LMP1 looking in the mirror. Nissan thought they'd been very clever for this, and in designing the carbon tub to resemble a boat hull, this was facilitated by the radical layout and a reportedly very cramped cockpit that put a strict height and breadth limit on potential drivers, they thought they'd been even cleverer. The engine's power plant was a Cosworth-designed and Nissan-fettled 3-liter twin-turbo V6 that produced about 550 horsepower, and since it was the late LMP1 era, they of course fitted a hybrid system. Nissan chose to use a KERS system in the 8 megajoule output bracket, similar in principle to the Audi R18, but harvesting much greater amounts of electrical energy from the brakes. For those who don't remember or are unaware, Audi at the time was running on the 2 megajoule bracket. This energy was stored in 2 flywheels, which actually would make it kinetic energy, not electrical energy. Anyway, up to 700 horsepower could be deployed exiting a corner or when attempting to overtake, but to either the front or rear wheels, so it was occasionally all-wheel drive, but in a very different way than the Audi or other LMP1s were. For those of you keeping score at home, yes, that's 1,250 horsepower, and given that a lot of that is hybrid horsepowers, you probably got a relatively world-stopping number of torques. Engine power went through an X-Track 5-speed sequential to the front wheels, while the stored flywheel energy could go either to the rear wheels by a secondary drive shaft, limited slip differential, and epicyclic gearboxes on each wheel, or to the fronts through the primary drive shaft traveling over the front of the engine, as the flywheels were located under the driver's legs. Suspension was multi-link wishbones and adjustable dampers. Braking came from 6-pot fronts and 4-pot rears, I believe from Brembo with carbon discs. Tires were, of course, from Michelin, and even if Le Mans didn't go particularly well in its debut year, which nobody really expected it to given the caliber of the competition and the car's radical departures from the norm, Nissan seemed committed to the effort for the long haul. Despite missing the first 2 rounds of the World Endurance Championship, due in part to additional FIA-mandated crash testing, 3 cars were prepared for Le Mans, featuring experienced hands like Harry Tincknell, Max Chilton, and Olivier Pla. However, in something of a theme with this video, the wheels fell off pretty much immediately. The trio of cars qualified last among all LMP1s, behind even the Privateer Rebellion and Bicolis machines, and they were more than 20 seconds off the pace of the pole-sitting Porsche 919. The slowest was a further 2 seconds in arrears behind the KCMG LMP2, which took pole for its class, but these were still dramatic improvements from the test day earlier in the year, which tells you how much ground they had yet to make up. Then, the number 23 missed the start, as it had busted its clutch, and eventually joined, but many laps down the racing order. The number 21 was the first of the 3 cars to retire, after 115 laps, so at least they managed better than the Astons of a few years prior, with suspension failure at Arnage that set a tire loose and left the car unable to keep racing. Another, unrelated tire dropped the number 22 from the running order when the car found it wandering about the Mulsanne Straight and seriously damaged its front bodywork. By morning, it was the number 23 car's turn to give up the ghost, with a blown gearbox leading to its retirement after 234 laps, and the lone number 22 soldiered on and did manage to cross the finish line when the checkered flag flew, but it was so far down the running order that it was unclassified for having completed an insufficient race distance. Leaving this substantial and very expensive debacle, Nissan spent a few months gathering their thoughts and started to test again at NOLA Motorsports Park at the end of the year, with an improved car reportedly under development for 2016, but instead they unexpectedly canceled the program and repurposed their resources elsewhere. To my knowledge, they haven't sent the cars out since for any on-track time, although I may have missed a Goodwood appearance or 2 between 2016 and now. One car, or a mock-up of it, was outside the Le Mans Museum in 2023, but as it was in a big glass box, I couldn't be 100% sure whether or not it was a mock-up or one of the race-run cars. Okay, and for this video's honorable mention, it's the car that y'all probably expected for the last video as an honorable mention, and actually that was intended for that before I decided to stick something more thematically appropriate in and talk about the J car. Yes, it's the Mercedes-Benz CLR, which might more appropriately have been named the VFR, but of course Germans don't have a sense of humor, so that wouldn't have happened. Mercedes had returned to La Sarthe for the first time in 50 years. As a full factory effort, the Sauber Group C cars were more of a collaboration with the CLK GTR, another of the definitely not a prototype Gov era GT1s that went toe-to-toe with Porsche and Toyota for dominance of that decade's racetracks. They followed this up with an updated version in 1998, the CLK LM, a car which won everything except for Le Mans in its year of competition, but GT1 died that year as well, which led Mercedes to choose between the open cockpit Le Mans prototype class or the closed cockpit Le Mans Grand Touring prototype class, with Mercedes opting for the latter as it allowed for better tie-ins with their road cars, and it seemed a more familiar path given their past years of experience. However, all was not the same. With GT1 dead and no major race series to compete in, they focused solely on Le Mans and GTP. Thus, the new CLR-A didn't have to be built with any compromises for road-going homologations, even if one never saw the road, Toyota. So AMG's motorsports division and chief designer Gerhard Unger could safely ignore things like minimum headlamp heights or space for road car comforts, rather than paying lip service as they had done in the Straßenversionen. Thus, the car was substantially lighter, with a much smaller cockpit and shorter length and wheelbase, while the wheel overhangs were noticeably longer than the outgoing GT1 vehicles. Using a monocoque partially carried over from the prior CLK, it eliminated the semi-tube frame for a pure carbon and aluminum honeycomb, while bodywork was molded carbon panels intended to bear a passing resemblance to a mix of the CLK and the newly launched flagship coupe, the CL, though this was largely limited to the front and rear lighting arrays and a squashed grille. The primary focus of the bodywork was minimal drag for the long Le Mans straights without compromising too much on downforce, and an almost complete lack of small scoops and intakes that one normally finds on such prototypes furthered this. The engine was an improved version of the CLKs and had its origins in the M119 naturally aspirated road-going V8 and earlier race-proved Sauber run power plants, with displacement increased to 5.7 liters as a compromise for the GTP rule set, in this instance capable of about 600 horsepower. X-Track was again providing motive power to the rear wheels with a 6-speed sequential box. AP carbon ceramic brakes provided stopping power. The suspension was, as one would expect, and carried over from the CLK LM, with Bridgestone continuing to provide tires. Total weight was allegedly slightly over the 900 kilogram class weight limit, but stats differ on exactly how much over. Development of the car commenced in September 1998 and had finished by February 1999, with one car commencing testing shortly afterwards in the US. Sidebar: I don't consider this to be anywhere near as serious a crash development program as the Aston Martin, even though it was essentially the same time frame, because, well, two things. One, this was much more of a development from a previous car, whereas the AMR-One was an effectively clean sheet design. And two, Mercedes has a lot more money. And money does solve many problems. Not all of them, but throwing money at a problem usually does make it resolve itself more quickly. Be that as it may, by May and Le Mans test day, Mercedes claimed that their new model had racked up almost 22,000 miles or 35,000 kilometers in testing around the world, all without major issue or failure. Mid-pack amongst the prototypes for test day, all three of Mercedes' entries were sufficiently quick to make the cut for the entry list, and qualifying looked like they were improving on their pace to sit closer to the front runners, when Mark Webber's car, the number 4, attempted an overtake of Frank Biela in his Audi R8R and suddenly became airborne, semi-somersaulting onto its side and skidding towards Indianapolis and into the barriers. Suffering very minor injuries, and after some physical therapy, Webber was given permission to participate in the race. In morning warm-up on Saturday, however, Webber was driving a rebuilt number 4 when he again became airborne, this time headed into Mulsanne Corner, and this time in view of the TV cameras, which were in full live broadcasting mode. While nobody had seen the first crash, obviously this one was seen by many people, and Mercedes, cognizant of their history in the past with cars taking off and going places that they didn't belong, hurriedly modified the two remaining entries in an effort to prevent this from happening again, based on consultation with Adrian Newey. They added dive planes to the front bodywork to increase downforce in that area, and they sent their drivers out with the cautionary note not to trail other cars too closely. The two remaining cars started the race actually quite well, swapping the lead positions with Toyota and BMW for the first 4 hours or so, until Peter Dumbreck was chasing the second-placed Toyota down towards Indianapolis when he kissed the apex of the track a bit too closely, and the car became again airborne in almost exactly the same spot as Webber's first incident, lifting and spinning through the air into the woods beside the track. Landing right side up, Dumbreck was nevertheless knocked unconscious, but he came to and clambered from the ruined vehicle, where he was found by officials and the gendarmes, and promptly tested for drunk driving, because that makes perfect damn sense. Only the French. Remarkably unhurt, Dumbreck was taken to the hospital to be checked over, quite sensibly, and the remaining CLR was retired on the same lap, and remains the Marque's last appearance at Le Mans to date. Plans for participation in the ALMS later that year were scrapped, and the remaining car was put away and made only rare appearances for many years, though it is now on display in an automobile museum in Germany, just not Mercedes's museum. Oh, since the Rolex was just a couple weeks ago, another honorable mention to the Cadillac V-Series R got properly off the ground for the first time as far as I'm aware, as we can see here. The car makes the best noise out of the entire LMDH, GTP, whatever we're calling it this week field, and now they've joined an august company of airborne vehicles that survived their aerial sojourns. Steady on, chaps. Well, it's happened again. You've wasted another perfectly good, 50 minutes or so watching Lensler. For this week's shameless plugs for other videos on the channel, we've previously covered the Porsche 956 and 962, as well as the Sauber Mercedes, in moderate detail in the Group C story video. We've talked about the BMW M1, Lola T70, Porsche 910, Acura ARX-03, Lola B08 series, Aston Martin DBR1-2, Delta Wing, and Panoz GT1s in their own videos. And of course, GT1 as a class has been discussed in DEFCON GT, Modern GT Racing Explained with Nuclear War. So if any of those topics interest you, go and check them out. That brings us to the end of the video. Hope you've enjoyed it. And for this week's call to action, not featuring the 3 sacred words of YouTube,
like, comment, subscribe.
I'd actually appreciate book suggestions for starting a reference library. Most of my research is either internet or primary source based, and the former can be a confusing and frustrating place from which to source information, while the latter is, quite entertaining and fun, but inordinately time consuming and quite hellacious on my liver. Paul, thank you, Paul, for providing a fine suggestion to start off with, Time and 2 Seats, and as soon as a reasonably priced copy shows up on eBay, if ever, I will be hopefully adding it to the bookshelf, but other suggestions are quite welcome as well. I think at this point you find folks can suss out what would and would not be within the general remit of the channel, but, always open to a little bit of a deviation as well. With that, it just leaves it for me to say thank you for your time this evening, or whenever and wherever you are watching, and I wish you all good night and a good tomorrow.